Bruno, you really came? Karol G asked, staring at him as if she still could not believe he was standing beside her on the SoFi Stadium stage. Bruno Mars smiled, but he did not answer right away. The music had just stopped after. Still, thousands of fans were screaming, and Karol suddenly stepped closer and wrapped her arms around him. For a few seconds, Bruno simply held her back. Then Karol pulled away, looked directly into his eyes, and whispered, "You actually came for me." Bruno's expression changed. He looked down, took a slow breath, and said quietly, "I told you I would." The crowd had no idea what those words meant. To them, it looked like a surprise duet. But for Bruno and Karol, this moment carried something much deeper. They had planned to perform together, but something that happened just moments before Bruno walked onto that stage had changed the entire night. Karol had been trying to stay composed, Bruno had been keeping something from her, and neither expected the other to react this way. Then Bruno raised his microphone and started, "Risk It All," while Karol stood beside him, visibly emotional. The stadium erupted, but Bruno kept looking at Karol instead of the crowd. And when he reached the final part of the song, he stopped singing for a moment and said something directly to her that made Karol freeze. What did Bruno say that night? And why did Karol suddenly realize that his appearance at SoFi was never just about the concert? This is a fictional dramatization created for entertainment, inspired by the imagined friendship and creative connection between Bruno Mars and Karol G. The final note of "Still" was still hanging in the stadium when Bruno noticed Karol had stopped moving. The band was ready to continue, the lights were still on, and more than 70,000 fans were screaming their names. But Karol was staring at Bruno like she had just realized something. Bruno lowered his microphone. "Karol, are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, but her eyes were already filling with tears. Then she stepped closer and whispered, "You kept your promise." Bruno gave a small smile. "Of course I did." For the audience, it looked like a sweet moment between two friends. But neither of them knew what would happen next. Karol turned toward the crowd, took a breath, and suddenly pointed back at Bruno. "One more song," she said. The band looked confused. Bruno looked at her and laughed. "You sure?" Karol nodded. "Risk It All." The opening music began, and the crowd exploded. Bruno moved toward the center of the stage, but before he could sing the first line, Karol reached for his hand. He stopped. She looked at him for several seconds. "I need you to stay with me for this one," she said. Bruno squeezed her hand. "I'm right here." Then the lights dropped. The entire stadium went dark except for one spotlight on Bruno and Karol. No one in the crowd knew why the performance had suddenly. Long before that night at SoFi, Bruno Mars and Karol G had already built a friendship that was very different from what fans saw on stage. It started with music, but it grew through small moments that had nothing to do with cameras or crowds. Bruno respected the way Karol could turn a simple melody into something personal. Karol admired how Bruno could walk into a studio, hear a few notes, and instantly know what the song needed. They did not always agree. Sometimes Bruno wanted to keep a section simple, while Karol wanted more emotion. Sometimes Karol pushed for a different vocal take, and Bruno would just smile and say, "Let's try it." That was what made their connection work. Neither needed to prove they were right. They wanted the song to feel right. During one late rehearsal, Karol watched Bruno repeat the same section several times. "You're overthinking it," she told him. Bruno laughed. "You noticed?" Karol nodded. "I always notice." He stopped, looked at her, and smiled. "That's dangerous." They both laughed, and the tension disappeared. But behind those jokes was something deeper. They had learned how to recognize when the other person was struggling without needing to ask. Bruno could tell when Karol was nervous by the way she held her microphone. Karol could tell when Bruno was tired by how quiet he became between takes. And instead of making those moments uncomfortable, they gave each other space. That trust became even stronger as they talked about what success meant to them. Bruno had spent years performing in front of massive audiences, but he understood that fame could never replace real connection. Karol felt the same way. She wanted her music to make people feel something, not simply make noise. One evening, while they were sitting backstage after rehearsal, Karol asked, "Do you ever get tired of this?" Bruno looked at the empty stage and answered, "Sometimes, but not when it means something." Karol stayed quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. "That's exactly how I feel." Neither of them knew it yet, but that conversation would matter on the night of the SoFi performance. Because when the pressure suddenly became real, their friendship would be tested in a way neither had expected. The idea had started as a simple conversation. One night, one stage, two voices, and no need to make it bigger than it was. But Bruno and Karol slowly began imagining something more. They wanted to create a performance that felt personal, not just impressive. "I want people to feel the song," Karol told him. Bruno nodded. "Then we don't need to force anything." Their plan was to bring Still and Risk It All together in one performance, letting the mood change naturally from quiet emotion to something much bigger. It sounded simple in the studio. On a massive stage, it was another story. There were rehearsals, timing issues, camera positions, lighting changes, and moments when Bruno questioned whether the idea was too risky. Karol noticed his hesitation. "You're thinking too much again," she said. Bruno smiled. "Maybe." She stepped closer. "Trust me." He looked at her for a moment before answering. "I do." That was the part that made the dream possible. They were not trying to outshine each other. They wanted to create one moment where neither of them had to carry the entire performance alone. But there was a problem. The closer they got to the SoFi show, the more complicated the plan became. A last-minute change threatened to remove one of the songs. Bruno was told the performance might have to be shortened. Karol was frustrated, but she refused to blame anyone. She called Bruno instead. "Are we still doing it?" she asked. Bruno paused. "I don't know yet." For the first time, Karol sounded worried. "Then we have to find a way." Bruno knew what she meant. They had spent too much time building this moment to let it disappear. So they made a quiet decision. If the official plan changed, they would adapt on stage. No big announcement. No explanation. Just trust. But neither Bruno nor Karol knew how difficult that decision would become once the lights came on and thousands of people were watching them. And somewhere between the first note of Still and the final beat of Risk It All, their carefully planned performance was about to become something neither of them had rehearsed. The first notes of Still filled SoFi Stadium, and Bruno immediately noticed that something was wrong. Karol was standing only a few feet away, but she was not looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the side of the stage, where a crew member had just given her a signal. Bruno kept singing, but his expression changed. He knew that signal. The original plan had been changed again. The second song might be cut. Karol took a slow breath and tried to stay focused, but Bruno could see the tension in her face. The cameras moved closer. Thousands of fans were singing along. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Then Bruno stepped toward Karol during the chorus. She looked at him and quietly asked, "Are we still doing it?" Bruno nodded once. "Trust me." The music continued, but neither of them knew if they would actually reach Risk It All. When Still ended, the crowd exploded. Karol smiled toward the audience, but her hands were shaking slightly. Bruno noticed. Instead of moving toward the next stage position, he stayed beside her. The band began preparing for the transition. Then the lights suddenly changed. A few seconds of silence followed. Karol looked at Bruno. Bruno looked back. There was no clear instruction from backstage. This was the moment they had feared. If they waited, the second song could disappear. If they moved forward, they could completely break the planned performance. Karol lowered her microphone and whispered, "What do we do?" Bruno took one breath and answered, "We do what we came here to do." He turned toward the band and gave a small signal. The first notes of "Risk It All" began. The crowd immediately erupted, but Karol did not sing yet. She was looking at Bruno, trying to understand whether he had really chosen to go against the plan for her. Then Bruno reached for her hand in front of the entire stadium. And in that moment, Karol realized the night was no longer following the script. For a moment, Karol did not move. Bruno was still holding her hand, and the opening notes of "Risk It All" were playing behind them. The original plan was gone. There was no signal from backstage, no clear instruction, and no time to stop and discuss what came next. Karol looked toward Bruno and asked quietly, "Are you sure?" Bruno nodded, but this time he did not smile. "If you're ready, I'm ready." Karol took a breath and looked toward the crowd. She could hear thousands of people chanting her name, but she seemed focused only on Bruno. Then she admitted, "I'm nervous." Bruno squeezed her hand. "Me too." That small answer changed the mood between them. Bruno was not pretending everything was under control. Karol was not pretending she had no doubts. They were both uncertain, but they trusted each other enough to continue. Karol finally nodded. "Then let's do it." Bruno stepped back and gave the band a signal. The music grew louder. Karol started the first line, and Bruno joined her a moment later. Their voices met in the middle of the stage, and the tension that had been building suddenly disappeared. The crowd began singing with them. Bruno glanced at Karol and smiled. She smiled back. For the first time that night, they knew they had made the right choice. But then Karol noticed something unexpected on Bruno's face. He was looking at her with the same serious expression he had backstage earlier. She stopped smiling. Bruno leaned closer and said, "There's something I need to tell you." Karol looked confused. "Now?" Bruno nodded. "Right now." The music continued around them, but Karol could barely hear it. Whatever Bruno was about to say had nothing to do with the performance. And if he told her what he had been keeping to himself, the meaning of that entire night could change. Bruno leaned closer, but he did not speak immediately. Karol was waiting, her eyes fixed on him, while the music continued softly behind them. The crowd was still cheering, unaware of the conversation happening between the two performers. Bruno finally said, "I almost didn't come tonight." Karol's expression changed. "Why?" Bruno looked toward the stage floor for a moment. "Because I thought you didn't need me." Karol shook her head. "That's not true." Bruno looked back at her. "I know that now." Karol took a breath and moved closer. "Then why did you come?" Bruno smiled slightly. "Because you asked me to." Karol's eyes filled with tears. She looked away, trying to regain control, but Bruno gently touched her shoulder. "Hey, we're okay." She nodded. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The band had lowered the volume, leaving space for the moment to breathe. Then Karol looked directly at Bruno and said, "I wanted you here because I trust you." Bruno answered without hesitation, "I trust you too." That was all they needed. Karol turned back toward the audience. Bruno stepped beside her. The music grew louder, and they began the final section of "Risk It All" together. Their voices were not competing. They were supporting each other. Bruno watched Karol take the lead, then followed her rhythm. Karol looked toward him during the chorus, and they shared a quick smile. The crowd responded with an even louder roar. But the most important moment came near the end. Bruno stopped singing and let Karol finish the line alone. She looked at him, surprised. Bruno simply nodded, giving her the space to finish. When her voice faded, he stepped forward and joined her for the final note. The stadium erupted. Karol immediately turned toward Bruno and hugged him tightly. Bruno closed his eyes and hugged her back. For a few seconds, they forgot about the cameras, the lights, and the thousands of people watching. It was no longer about proving anything. It was simply two friends standing on a stage, realizing that trust had carried them through the moment they thought they might lose. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but neither Bruno nor Karol rushed to let go. When they finally stepped apart, Karol wiped the tears from her face and laughed. "You made me cry on my own stage." Bruno smiled. "You started it." She shook her head, still laughing. The tension from earlier was gone. For the first time that night, they could simply enjoy being together. Bruno looked toward the crowd, then back at Karol. "You ready?" he asked. Karol lifted her microphone. "Always." The band started a softer version of the song, and instead of immediately singing, Bruno and Karol walked toward the edge of the stage together. Thousands of phone lights appeared across the stadium. Karol looked at them and whispered, "Look at that." Bruno nodded. "They're with us." Then Karol turned to him. "No, Bruno. They're with the song." Bruno smiled. "That's even better." They returned to the center of the stage. This time, there was no pressure to follow the original plan. They simply sang. Karol took the first part, Bruno answered, and then their voices came together. Between lines, they smiled at each other like two friends who had just survived something difficult and could finally breathe again. Near the end, Karol leaned toward Bruno and said, "Thank you for coming." Bruno answered quietly, "I wouldn't miss it." Karol paused. "Even if they changed everything?" Bruno laughed. "Especially then." She laughed too. Then, they finished the song together. The crowd erupted, but Bruno and Karol stayed side by side, taking in the moment. What happened next was smaller than the performance itself. Karol reached over, straightened Bruno's jacket, and said, "Now you look ready." Bruno looked down at his jacket and laughed. "I was ready 5 minutes ago." Karol smiled. "No. Now you're ready." They both laughed again. It was a simple exchange, but it showed exactly what had changed between them. They were no longer two artists trying to make a perfect performance. They were two friends who had learned that the best moments sometimes happen when the plan falls apart. And neither of them realized that one final revelation was still waiting backstage. The crowd was still cheering when Bruno and Karol finally walked backstage. Their microphones were still in their hands, and both were breathing heavily after the performance. Karol looked at Bruno and smiled. "We actually did it." Bruno nodded. "We did." But before they could say anything else, Karol noticed a small envelope sitting on a table near the dressing room. Her name was written on it. She looked at Bruno. "Did you know about this?" Bruno shook his head. "No." Karol opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten note with only one sentence. "Some moments matter because you choose who stands beside you." Karol read it twice. Then she looked at Bruno. "Did you write this?" He shook his head again. "Not me." For a few seconds, they stood silently. Then Karol turned the paper over and found a second message. "You already know why tonight mattered." Bruno looked at her. Something about those words made him stop smiling. He finally admitted that before the show, he had received a message telling him that Karol was having doubts about performing the duet. Bruno had almost stayed away because he did not want to put more pressure on her. But Karol had never sent that message. She looked confused. "Then who did?" Bruno had no answer. The mystery suddenly made the entire night feel different. Karol looked back at the stage entrance, where the sound of the crowd was still shaking the walls. Maybe someone wanted us to cancel, she said. Bruno shook his head. Or maybe someone wanted us to realize something. Karol looked at him. What? Bruno paused before answering. That we don't need permission to trust each other. Karol smiled through the tears still sitting in her eyes. She folded the note and placed it back inside the envelope. Neither of them knew who had left it there, and neither would ever get a clear answer. But the message stayed with them. Because the real revelation was not about who wrote the note. It was about why Bruno had come, why Karol had asked him to stay, and why their friendship had survived the moment when everything around them seemed ready to fall apart. The next morning, Bruno and Karol were no longer thinking about the crowd or the cameras. They kept thinking about the moment when everything went wrong, and they chose to trust each other anyway. Karol called Bruno first. Did you sleep? She asked. Bruno laughed. Not really. She smiled. Me neither. For a few seconds, neither said anything. Then Karol admitted, I keep thinking about that stage. Bruno answered, So do I. What changed was not their music career or their public image. It was something much simpler. They had learned that their friendship did not depend on perfect plans. Before that night, Bruno often tried to control every detail of a performance. Karol was more willing to follow her instincts. After SoFi, they understood the value in each other's approach. Bruno became more comfortable letting moments happen naturally. Karol became more confident trusting her instincts when things did not go according to plan. A few days later, they met again in a quiet studio. There were no cameras and no audience. Bruno sat at the piano, while Karol stood beside the microphone. He played a few notes from Still. Karol smiled. That night changed the song for me. Bruno looked up. How? She answered. Before, I heard the lyrics. Now I remember the feeling. Bruno nodded. Then he played a different progression, and Karol started singing softly. They stopped after a few seconds and laughed. It was not perfect. That was the point. They were not trying to recreate the SoFi performance. They were trying to understand what had happened between them. Bruno looked at Karol and said, Maybe we should stop chasing perfect moments. Karol smiled. Maybe we should just make honest ones. That sentence stayed with both of them. Their friendship had changed. Their creative partnership had become stronger, and the night they thought might fall apart had given them something they could not have planned. But there was still one question they had never answered. Who left that mysterious note backstage, and why did its message seem to describe their friendship so perfectly? Months after that night at SoFi Stadium, the memory of the performance still followed Bruno Mars and Karol G in ways neither of them expected. It was not the size of the crowd they remembered most. It was not the lights, the cameras, or the reaction when "Risk It All" began. It was the moment when everything stopped going according to plan, and they had to decide whether they trusted each other enough to keep going. That decision became the real meaning of the night. For Bruno, the experience changed the way he looked at performing. He had always cared about preparation. Every detail mattered to him. Every note, every movement, every transition had a purpose. But after SoFi, he started accepting something he had spent years trying to control. Sometimes the most powerful moments cannot be rehearsed. Sometimes a pause says more than a perfect vocal. Sometimes a look between two friends can communicate more than an entire speech. And sometimes the person standing beside you matters more than the size of the stage. Karol felt the same change, but in a different way. She had always trusted her emotions when creating music. She could laugh during a rehearsal, change a line at the last second, or stop everything because something did not feel right. But that night taught her another lesson. Trusting your instincts did not mean doing everything alone. Sometimes instinct meant knowing when to reach for someone else. Bruno had been that person for her. Not because he had all the answers, but because he stayed when the plan became uncertain. That became one of the things Karol valued most about their friendship. One afternoon, they met again in a quiet studio. There were no cameras waiting outside. No crowd. No stage manager giving instructions. Just Bruno at the piano and Karol standing near the microphone. Bruno played a few soft chords, and Karol listened. "Do you remember SoFi?" he asked. Karol smiled. "How could I forget?" Bruno laughed. "You almost made me regret coming." She looked at him. "You almost didn't come." Bruno stopped playing. "Fair point." They both laughed. It was easy now. The tension that had surrounded the performance was gone. What remained was a friendship that had become stronger because of it. Karol walked toward the piano and sat beside him. "I still think about that moment," she said. "Which one?" Bruno asked. "When you said you almost didn't come." Bruno looked down at the keys. "I meant it." Karol became quiet. "Why were you really scared?" Bruno took a moment before answering. "I didn't want to disappoint you." Karol shook her head. "You thought you could disappoint me?" Bruno nodded. "Maybe." She looked directly at him. "You should know something." Bruno waited. "You don't have to be perfect with me." He smiled, but this time, there was no joke behind it. "Neither do you." Karol looked down and smiled. That conversation mattered because it showed how far they had come. Their friendship was no longer built around music alone. They had seen each other under pressure. They had seen uncertainty. They had seen each other without the confidence that usually came with being on stage. And instead of becoming distant, they became closer. The mysterious note from SoFi still existed, folded inside a small notebook Karol kept with her songwriting papers. She had never thrown it away. Neither she nor Bruno ever discovered who left it. Sometimes they joked about it. "Maybe you wrote it," Karol would say. Bruno would shake his head. "I told you, it wasn't me." "Then who was it?" she would ask. "Maybe we'll never know." And eventually, that became okay. They stopped trying to solve the mystery. The note had done what it needed to do. It had made them stop and think about why they had chosen each other that night. The answer was simple. It was trust. Not the kind of trust people talk about when everything is easy, but the kind that appears when something goes wrong, and you still choose to stay. That became the part of the story that mattered most. The performance itself became a memory for the fans, but for Bruno and Karol, it became a reminder. A reminder that friendship can exist in places where people expect competition. A reminder that two successful artists can stand on the same stage without trying to take anything away from each other. And a reminder that creative partnerships become stronger when both people feel safe enough to be honest. One evening, months later, Karol sent Bruno a short message. "Would you do it again?" Bruno knew exactly what she meant. He replied, "The whole night?" Karol answered, "Even the part where everything went wrong." Bruno waited for a moment before typing. "Especially that part." Karol smiled when she read it. She did not need a longer answer. She understood. If they ever stood together on another stage, they knew there was no guarantee everything would go perfectly. The lights could change. The timing could fail. The plan could collapse. Someone could tell them to stop. But they also knew what they had learned. They could look at each other and find their way forward. That was the real legacy of SoFi. Not a viral clip. Not a headline. Not the number of people who watched the performance. It was the relationship that remained after the lights went out. Bruno once believed that the best performances were the ones where nothing went wrong. Karol had always believed that emotion could make a performance memorable. After that night, they found the middle ground. The best performances were not necessarily perfect. They were honest. They made people feel something. They created a memory that stayed long after the final note. And that was exactly what happened with Still and Risk it all. The songs ended, but the feeling did not. It stayed with Bruno. It stayed with Karol. And it stayed with everyone who imagined what it would be like to have someone beside them who would say, "I'm right here," when everything suddenly became uncertain. In the end, Bruno Mars and Karol G did not need a perfect explanation for what happened at SoFi. They did not need to know who left the note. They did not need another dramatic moment to prove their connection. They had already found the answer on stage. When Karol reached for Bruno's hand, he stayed. When Bruno hesitated, Karol trusted him. When the plan disappeared, they trusted each other. That was enough. And maybe that is why the hug after, still, became more meaningful than anyone in the stadium understood. Karol was not simply hugging a guest performer. Bruno was not simply embracing a fellow artist. In that moment, they were acknowledging everything that had happened between them. The doubts, the conversations, the disagreements, the laughter, the fear, the trust, and finally the relief of knowing they had made it through together. The crowd saw two stars sharing a powerful moment. Bruno and Karol saw something much simpler. Two friends who had kept a promise. As the years moved forward, the memory of that night would become less about what happened on stage and more about what happened between them. The world might remember the surprise. Fans might remember the hug. Others might remember the songs. But Bruno and Karol would remember the decision they made when the plan started falling apart. They chose to stay. They chose to trust. They chose each other. And that is what made the night unforgettable. Because sometimes a legacy is not created by the biggest performance or the loudest applause. Sometimes it begins with one person asking, "Are you sure?" and another person answering, "I'm right here." That simple exchange can change everything. And if Bruno Mars and Karol G ever stand together under those lights again, they will not need to wonder whether the moment will be perfect. They will already know what matters. The music can change. The stage can change. The crowd can change. But the trust between them will still be there. And perhaps that is the most powerful ending of all. Not that their story finished at SoFi, but that the night gave them a reason to keep creating, keep trusting, and keep reminding each other that the best moments in life are rarely the ones we plan perfectly. They are the ones we choose to live together. This story is a fictional dramatization created for entertainment, and is not presented as a confirmed account of real events involving Bruno Mars or Karol G.